I'm going to open it up to the floor now. I know there are going to be millions of questions. So.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Boyer from Appalachian State. I would like to ask Klaus, why isn't the World Bank authorized $30 million loan to Deininger in Honduras for palm oil production in the midst of since 2008, the killings of peasants on the very land reform, before and after the coup in Honduras? I'd like to know why the loan last year was authorized to Honduras, to Deininger Corporation.
Roman Herr from Germany. One question to the person from DFID. You said, you mentioned that I'm totally agree to that voluntary guidelines or other instruments are absolutely not enough. And this morning we have heard that something like 50 actors, investors are coming from Great Britain. And my question to you is if you have any activities or engagement with these investors either in the host countries or here in in Great Britain. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the attention on land grabbing is really calling attention to something much deeper and much more fundamental, which is the longer term inability of poor people, increasing inability of poor people to hold on to their land. And so hearing donors talk about increasing good land governance, to me, I'm wondering to what extent some of the lessons of the past have been learned. I mean, GIZ, for example, your experience in Cambodia, the World Bank, of trying to put in a good land governance system that in the end gets used by the elites to increase essentially land grabbing. And are we moving more towards talking about pro-poor land governance and taking pro-poor land governance more seriously? And in intervening in the land sector, asking ourselves to what extent is this going to exacerbate inequality, or to what extent is it going to hold up the ability of the poor? Is it a question to anyone in the panel? Do you see this as where you're moving towards, or is it still something?
Question right?
Hi, getting back to the issue of money, Ponce Anderson from LSE. I think Iris at the end mentioned something about budget support, and then Klaus was talking about how pointing the finger at sort of finance, the finance sector. So, if a lot of what we've heard today is that land agreements are actually driven by sort of a search for foreign exchange and sort of what we're seeing as sort of a privatized form of development, what is DFID and sort of what the World Bank's doing in terms of rethinking the logic of aid? And if budget support is not a priority in terms of expanding the uses of the state. I mean, for instance, is DFID still going to sort of, pay for schools and allow the government to say, redirect all the money into sort of larger capital-intensive projects? That's kind of stuff. So what is sort of the World Bank and sort of DFID doing to sort of rethink the logic of aid when countries are sort of taking an alternate path?
The land question, but it's relevant to that. Immediately behind you.
Thank you, Alberto Alonso from IDR Guatemala. Just a brief reminder about these land policy recommendations. Regarding Mr. Deininger's statement about that the lack of land rights recognition by recipient countries is an incentive for investors, I think it is worth noting that at least in the case of Guatemala and Honduras, talking about Central America, we found that up to 90% of the dispossessed peasants had their land title. Around 80% individually and 20% communally, which reinforces two main facts. First, that titling, the well-known thing that titling might be a necessarily but definitely not sufficient mechanism to secure land tenure rights. It's necessary to go for new solutions for these old problems. And second, that the orthodox and individual private land titling schemes promoted through market-led agrarian reforms in these countries it's been the best way to lose your land. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Ian. I'm Jenny Bromley from Global Witness. We've had a lot of discussion about the importance of bringing the private sector into this. And we've heard from Bodo the example of TWS pulling out of its investments in Cambodia because of their reputation, protecting their reputation. However, there is a number of companies and investors, especially from emerging economies, who don't seem to care so much about reputational risk. So I'd like to ask your agencies what you're doing to broaden out the discussion and bring those kind of private sector players into the discussions who aren't necessarily swung by reputational risk concerns.
Good question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Gustavo Oliveira of University of California, Berkeley. So y'all talk about voluntary guidelines, code of conduct, good governance, and then you turn to us, researchers, and tell us that we should aid in implementation and enforcement and disclosure. So I want to turn this back over to y'all and ask in the interest of disclosure, if you will help us understand some of the internal conflicts within your organizations so that we can better know how to strategize our own research. And I would especially like to hear about the internal conflicts in the World Bank and the FAO.
Ann Parrow from the Center for International Environmental Law, and I have a question for Klaus. Klaus, you focused on transparency, which I really appreciated. You mentioned the importance of impact assessments, and but this effort the bank is making to increase transparency runs into what the IFC is doing through its lending to financial intermediaries and private equity. Transparency standards, as you know, don't apply to the lending. Once the money is given to those banks and the financial intermediaries, we don't know where the money goes. We don't know where the projects are. We have no impact assessment information about those projects. And so I'm wondering how you feel about this. This, you know, it's half of IFC lending right now, as you know, is this form of lending. So I'd appreciate your thoughts on this. Thanks.
I would just add to that last question two examples where transparency may have actually decreased. One of them is MIGA's, where it's MIGA's backed projects in agriculture where those are not available. They are available for industries such as bottling and juice making and so on, but not agricultural production per se. And another one is I have to wonder where the Access to Land initiative went after it disappeared under Fiat. So those are two examples where I think transparency has actually decreased.
Right. Okay.
Hans from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I think it's great that you have voluntary codes and principles to protect the development interest in large-scale land acquisitions. But at the same time, to protect the investor interest in large-scale land acquisitions, you have over 3,000 bilateral investment treaties. Germany being the first one to sign one with 135, the UK with 126, and the Netherlands with about 100. Now, my sort of request to you is take a voluntary code and take the Dutch bilateral investment treaty and compare the difference in the kinds of rights that and protections these treaties provide versus what you have in the voluntary principles. And that's my question. Right.